Good morning, everyone.
Good morning,
Good morning,
Rabbi.
Rabbi.
We are learning Mishnah Shabbos, Perek Aleph, Chapter 11, Mishnah Hey, Mishnah 5. I'd like to dedicate our learning this morning in memory of my mother, Mrs. Shalamis Rabinowitz. Shalamis Basa Rav Yaakov Eliezer. Our learning should be an aliyah for her neshama.
Amen.
Okay, Hazarek Minayam Liyabasha. If you throw something from the sea to the dry land, and we're talking about the dry land is a Rishus Harabim, is a public domain. Minayabasha liyam, or from the dry land, the Rishus Harabim dry land, liyam into the sea. Minayam lesfina, or from the sea onto a boat. The boat is a Rishus Hayachid, a private domain. Minasfina liyam, or from the boat to the sea, from the Rishus Hayachid private domain to the sea. Minasfina lachaverta, or from one boat to the other. Putter, you are exempt. There is no liability from the Torah for what you've done as an act of transferring. So let's go through each case. You're throwing from the sea to the dry land. The sea has the status of a carmelis. It's not a private domain. It's not a public domain. It's a carmelis. So as a carmelis, if you throw from a carmelis to a Rishus Harabim, or from the dry land to the sea, means from Rishus Harabim to a carmelis, there's no Torah liability for that. Menayam lesvina, in the second case, you're throwing from the water, from the sea onto a boat. The boat is a private domain. Typically, a boat is going to have the dimensions for a private domain. It's going to be 4x4 tefachim in area, and it's going to have walls that are 10 tefachim high. That's typically what a boat's going to have. And therefore, if it would be a raft, it'd be a different story. But we're talking about a boat. And therefore, the sea is a carmelis. You're throwing from the carmelis to a private domain, or from the boat to the sea, from private domain to a carmelis. There is no Torah. There's no liability from the Torah for what you've done. Now, the last case is from a boat to another boat. Now, the boats are private domains, right? But what you're doing is you have here a case of throwing from a private domain to another private domain through a carmelis. See, we had a case before where you're throwing from a private domain to another private domain, and what's going in between? A Rishus Harabim, a public domain, right? Two sides of the street. Mm-hmm. Here, that's not the case. Here, the case is a private domain to a private domain, but through a carmelis. Since it's through a carmelis, therefore, there is no liability from the Torah for what you've done. Now, what's important to point out is, as a rule, as a general rule, whenever it says putter, which means exempt means you're exempt from bringing a sin offering if you did this unintentionally. That means there's no liability from the Torah. But midrabanan, according to rabbinic law, it's forbidden. So all the things that we just said that you're not liable for means you're not liable from the Torah. You wouldn't have to bring a sin offering if you did it unintentionally. But midrabanan, according to rabbinic law, you're not allowed to do these things. You may not throw from a carmelis to a public domain or vice versa, or from a carmelis to a private domain, vice versa, or from a private domain to a private domain through a carmelis. All those things are midrabanan aser, according to rabbinic law, forbidden. Now, next case. Sfinais, kashurais, zu bezu. You have two boats, and they're tied to one another. Metaltalin mizay, you can carry from one to the other. Now, this needs explanation. The two boats, the case here is you've got two boats. They belong to two different people. And you want to be able to carry from one boat to the other. Now, the rule is that, again, this is midrabanan according to rabbinic law. If you want to carry from one house to another house, right, and you're doing that through a courtyard, I shouldn't say that. You have two houses, two people are sharing a courtyard, and you want to transfer from one house to the other house, you need what's called an Erev Chatzeris. You can't just do it. You have to make an Erev Chatzeris, which means you need to basically combine everything. All these homes have to be considered like it's shared by everyone. And the way that's done is that whoever is living in this chatzer, they contribute towards a loaf of bread, and it's put in one house. And by doing so, it's called that everybody shares that house. Everybody kind of lives in that house. And therefore, it's that since it's basically now everybody's in one house, therefore we say that now you can carry from one to the other. So these two boats are the equivalent of that, right? They're both Rishus Hayachid. They belong to two different people. If you want to carry something from one to the other, you need an Erev Chatzeris.
There's no courtyard.
Good question. but you still need Erev Chatzeris. You need an Erev Chatzeris. So I'm afraid you're going to ask that question.
You need that Erev if you've got two houses.
Martin, good
other?
question. I would tell you that if they're even if you're not going through the Chatzer, but if there are two houses in the same Chatzer, you're going to need it.
What if the two houses are joined?
Makes a difference.
Doesn't matter. Okay, but that's the boat.
What?
That's the boat.
That's the boat. Okay. So I think that's the answer to your question. Okay. Now, the thing is that okay, so you made your Erev Chatzeris, and from that point I can carry from one to the other. But the Mishnah says the two boats have to be tied to each other. And we'll see why soon. The two boats have to be tied to each other for your Erev Chatzeris, for you to be allowed to use your Erev Chatzeris to carry from one boat to the other. Im Einon Kashurais, if they are not tied together, the Mishnah continues, even though they're right next to each other, you cannot carry from one to the other. The issue here is like this. Even if I make an Erev Chatzeris from these two boats, if let's say these two boats start separating from each other, and there is 4 tvachim of a Carmelis now in between, meaning if the two boats separate, and now there's 4 tvachim of water, which is Carmelis, in between these two boats, these two private domains, the Erev Chatzeris is kaput. Doesn't work anymore. Mm-hmm. And therefore, you have to, so now therefore we say, in the first, so therefore there's no question, the two boats have to be near each other. Because then I don't have the Carmelis messing up anything. I have the Carmelis messing up anything. The thing is that the Rabbanan took an extra precautionary measure here. And they said the boats have to be tied to each other. If they're tied to each other, then they won't separate. But if they're not tied to each other, we're afraid that they may separate. So you made an Erev Chatzeris, you're going to think that you can go ahead and carry between the two of them. But now that they separated, which is not a big amount for tvachim, right? You really can't use it anymore. And therefore the Chachamim said, in the case of the two boats, if they're not tied to each other, you cannot carry in between them, even though presently they're right next to each other and there is no Carmelis separating between them. But because of the problem that they could separate, and that's very understandable on water, that's going to happen. Yeah. That therefore they said, even if you make an Erev Chatzeris and they're right next to each other, and presently they're not separated by 4 tvachim of water, you still can't carry in it. Now, this halacha about the boats being tied together is talking about where both boats, which again are Rishus HaYachad private domain, belong to 2 different people. Okay, they belong to 2 different people, and therefore they need an Erev Chatzeris. But let's say the 2 boats belong to each other. Belong to the same person. Sorry, they belong to the same person. So then the halacha is, I don't need Erev Chatzeris. And not only that, the fact that even if, let's say, they separate by 4 tvachim, there's a Carmelis going in between, it's not a problem. Because what should be the problem? Well, I'm going from a Rishus HaYachid to Rishus HaYachid through a Carmelis. Okay? Now, we said before, if you do that, you're exempt. But according to rabbinic law, it's still forbidden to do. Midrabanan, it's still forbidden to do. But that prohibition that the Rabbanan made, the sages made, about going from a Rishus HaYachid to Rishus HaYachid through a Carmelis, which is, and the reason they said you shouldn't do it is because it's similar. We consider it similar enough to a public domain. That's only when it belongs to 2 different people. Mm-hmm. If it belongs to the same person, they never made that prohibition. So therefore, if the 2 boats belong to the same person, as long as they're next to each other, even if they're not tied to each other, I shouldn't say that. I'm sorry. If they belong to the same person, I can throw from one to the other, even if there is 4 tvachim in between them. Mm-hmm. The Mishnah that says they have to be tied to each other, right next to each other and tied to each other, is talking about the 2 boats belong to 2 different people. Have a wonderful day and a wonderful Shabbos.
Good Shabbos. Thank you, Rabbi.